I'm Bob Crawford,
I'm Ben Sawyer.
and this is The Road to Now. We are so happy today to welcome Max Perry Mueller to The Road to Now to talk about his new book, Wakara's America. This is such a complicated individual and a undertold story, an undertold part of American history. So give us context, introduce us to Wakara and set the table for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks to both of you for having me on today. It's a real honor. I'm a big fan of the show. And so, yeah, Wakara was I describe him as a founding father of the American West that many people haven't heard of. And why? It's because, well, he's a Native American, and there is no kind of Native American. There's no place for a Native American in our origin stories, especially around Manifest Destiny. One of the biggest claims of Manifest Destiny is that it succeeded and in removing both Native peoples and Native histories from the land. And Wakara, his story shows how very influential Wakara himself was on the creation of what becomes the American West. But also his descendants, with whom I work very closely, show that if you ever go to Indian country, and that can be on reservations, that can be in cities. That's all of America, really. One of the most common refrains is, "We are still here." So part of the idea of the book is to point out that longevity, that presence, that resilience. But Wakara himself was born around 1815 in what is now the central part of Utah, just south of what is called Utah Lake, which is the third largest freshwater body of water in west of the Mississippi. And he rose to fame fairly quickly and soon became one of the greatest horse thieves in the American West. He stole thousands of horses from the Californios in Southern California, running them along the old Spanish Trail to markets in New Mexico and along the trail. Along the way, he also became one of the greatest enslavers of Native peoples. He enslaved the Paiutes, who were in southern Utah. He was a Ute, part of the Timpanogos band of Utes. And he enslaved non-equestrian Paiutes whom he sold in California and in New Mexico along that Spanish Trail. So I describe him having provided the horse and human power to power the fuel, the expansion of the American West. He also was a great designer of the West in terms of the political and cultural geography. He would he helped expand the old Spanish Trail, which ran from the northern New Mexican outpost to California, and he also helped all the great explorers in the 1840s, especially John C. Fremont, literally write the maps that became the maps of the American West that other later explorers and settlers used to come west. So he had a huge impact on. He was a key figure, as I say, in the drama of the expanding American West in the 1840s.
His story and his ascendancy, it coincides in his life with the arrival of the Mormons in the area. And I was swept away with this book because it was both teaching me about the story of Native Americans that I hadn't really heard, but also because the Mormons in my life, you hear the stories about the Mormons. The Mormons in my life are all like super kind people who seem to be incredibly industrious, pretty happy where they are. So but then you have this story, and as someone who studies American history, this is one of my blind spots, but the story is controversial. And so is the notions of, the treatment of the Native Americans. What's amazing to me is the way that as they show up, Wakara, and much the way that Kathleen Duvall writes about with the first explorers in Roanoke, he doesn't see these folks as immediately challengers to his authority. He actually sees them as an opportunity for him. And could you kind of give this background story of the arrival of the Mormons, his ascendancy story, and why he particularly finds their arrival to be advantageous?
Yeah, absolutely. And Kathleen, Professor Duvall, was kind enough to. So offer some advanced praise of the book. And this book, her book, her scholarship in general, but especially her latest Pulitzer Prizing book, really helped me think through some of the issues that you're raising here. So yeah, when the Mormons arrive, he has bested. No one has been able to colonize. No European Americans have been able to colonize the kind of central part of the Great Basin that he dominates, that his people dominate. And so, Dominguez and Escalante had come through. The Spanish had tried to make inroads. Of course, there were fur traders, etc. So, but he and his people really controlled this area of what is now central Utah, northern New Mexico, Nevada, and into California, that old Spanish trail. And so when the Mormons arrive, he's like, yes, more people I can sell my horses to, more people I can trade and slave Indians to. And he partners with them. He literally pilots them. That's the language that shows up in the archive, to the first settlements outside of the Salt Lake Valley, and says, hey, I want you to establish your colonies here, here, and here, because that's will help me push out some rivals he had for the leadership of the Utes, and also create new nodes on his vast network of trade in horses and slaves. So yeah, he very much saw the Latter-day Saints as allies, and and this is something that really is completely kind of lost in the memory of Wakara, is that he became at least a public memory, because he's seen in the Utah story as kind of the archetypical Indian antagonist when the Mormons write about their history with Native Americans. But the Mormons, he was a Mormon too, or he became at least officially a Mormon. He was baptized into the church, and he became the first Latter-day Saint priesthood holder, or Native American priesthood holder in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, like my colleague and dear friend Lynn Fisher does in his work, though, Wakara didn't see himself as converting in the kind of Christian sense of conversion, which is a complete replacement of one's old beliefs with a new kind, right? The kind of American evangelical sense, even, or of that completely, abandoning one's past culture. He saw it, as Lynn Fisher says, an affiliation with the Latter-day Saints, that this was another network he could tap into, a spiritual one, perhaps, but certainly a political one and a familial one.
He was a cunning leader.
Absolutely.
He was cunning, and nowhere. Well, that's exhibited in your book several places, but what stood out to me was when he goes to California to steal horses, and he makes friends with the family who owns all the thousands of acres at this point, right? And he's befriending them, and they say, yeah, stay here, you can, yeah, sure, stay here. And meanwhile, he's stealing the horses. Talk about that for a little bit. Like, was he charismatic?
It certainly sounds so, and all the different folks who meet him describe him as that he could trade with white men as good as or better than any other white trader. And certainly he seems charismatic. Yeah. So that story with the Lugos of Central and Southern California, the Lugo family was the largest Californio, as in Spanish speaking and probably Spanish descent, family in American California, during what we call Alta California. And so in the 1840s, and in one particular case, the 1845, he rolls in with, previously he had attacked the Lugos with large cavalries, and they expected him in 1845 to come in with a large cavalry of warriors, intertribal, with other Indians, with mountain men. But he comes with a family presentation. He brings his wives, he brings his lieutenants, brings their families. And I describe it as like, hey, we're coming not to raid you, but to trade. And we're going to have a trading fair. And the Lugos say, hey, come in and make yourself at home. And they set up tents. And, and have an extensive trade in horses and probably slaves too at that point. All the while, he's casing the place, looking to figure out where the weak spots in the corrals are and how he's going to attack. And over the next few months, yes, he sends warriors at nighttime in these nighttime raids, they're described, and collecting a few dozen horses here, a few dozen horses there, and then he runs them over the Cajon Pass in by the San Bernardino Valley, and he keeps them there until they've built up a large enough group of horses to bring back along the old Spanish Trail. So, and this was an annual thing he did in the 1840s. This season of horse stealing, but absolutely he convinced, connived the Lugos, who had massive holdings, as you described, all the way from San Bernardino to LA, which was just a dusty village at this point. They owned a lot of that land. And so he saw them again as targets. So all these Anglo-Americans and Euro-American settlers and colonizers, he saw as targets for an expansion opportunities in his slave trade and his horse thieving.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny you say, you're like, if I was to like say somebody was like the worst, I would be like, he's a slave trader and a horse thief. Yet this guy builds these networks and people find that he can be useful to them. And I think the whole story is so fascinating there. Now, when the Mormons arrive, you point this out that in the valley there, right outside of Provo, I believe it is.
The Utah Valley.
Right, the Utah Valley. I love this moment where you write about how he looks at them, sees them settling there. And, we, in our story, I think the big narrative is, Europeans are showing up. We know what's next. To him, he was like, I've seen them come and go. It's beautiful here. There's a lot of resources. Mm-hmm. They show up and then they're like, it's too far away from everything. And then they eventually leave. He wasn't ready for the group of people who were trying to get far away from everything. And that's where they caught him up. So could you talk about what it is that brings the Mormons into this area at this moment and kind of fill us in on that story as we see? We've got Wakara's story, the story of the Latter-day Saints. Tell the story behind how they collide.
Just backing up a teeny bit, if I may, talking about how I got on to the story of Wakara. My first book, which was based on my dissertation, and called Race in the Making of the Mormon People, which I published gratefully with the University of North Carolina Press, looked at how the Latter-day Saints created race, understood race, and created race as a category that, like politics, like religion, that Joseph Smith's new, the founder of Mormonism, his new or restored church would get rid of. He wanted to end all schisms in the human family, and race was among those schisms. So what I did in that first book is looked at how the Latter-day Saints constructed various races. Certainly, in America in the antebellum period when Mormonism emerges, blackness is certainly is the largest category, but Native being, black, red, and white are kind of the three major categories racial categories that the Mormons create in hopes of getting rid of. And they thought of their church their new dispensation as so powerful that people who joined the church could literally shed the racial markers that they had inherited from their anti-hero forefathers, whether they be black people supposedly descended from Cain and Ham, of course, marked with these curses, which, of course, in the text don't have racial markings. We have long read race into them. But Native American...
So just to be clear here, they create racial categories themselves, define their own racial categories in order to dispose of them. This is very Stalinist, by the way. Just
is it?
thinking.
Yes. Well, yes. And I mean, yes. And to you have to, in some ways, present the problem. And right. Of course, race was certainly a problem, not just for the Latter-day Saints, but their theologies are so specific, and certainly they emerge out of Christianity, but their theologies are very specific, especially around Native Americans, whom the Book of Mormon can be read as a story of the origins of Native Americans.
Yeah, can I just interject here? That sounded like I was making a very politicized statement. It's just that the way that the vision of the Soviet Union is very similar. We're going to create the categories of Kazakhs, Uzbeks, all this stuff, and we need to do this so that we can eventually eliminate them. I just think that's a fascinating parallel.
It's a terrific parallel, and thank you for making that. I mean, there are lots of, as I say towards the end of the work, creating these categories of division have long been the tools of people wielding power, and then presenting themselves as the only solution to eliminate these powers.
Yes, that is awesome. Yeah.
So the Book of Mormon is a story of the origins of Native Americans, which had kind of flummoxed people for a long time because, after the flood, now we're getting way back, but after the flood of Noah, God, as I say to my students, God with the flood pushes a reset button on humanity because, hey, humanity hasn't gone so well. And so Noah is an opportunity to reset the human family. And then Noah's three sons, Japheth, supposedly populates the Europe. Shem, as in Sem, is Semitic, populates Near East and Asia. And then Ham, supposedly, populates Africa. Well, when Columbus, etc., hit the New World, who are these people? They don't fit into our post-Diluvian, post-flood world. So are they humans even? And so, of course, enslaving, killing Native peoples perhaps because they aren't even human and therefore aren't worthy of fair care is a long justification for colonization. But the Latter-day Saints actually solve this story, or the Book of Mormon presents itself as an answer to this story of where Native Americans come from, because they see it as the Native Americans are descendants of lost tribes of Israel who have fled the New World in the 6th century before Christ, and then kind of emerged at these rival factions. The Book of Mormon is very, very complicated, much more complicated and interesting than a lot of people give it credit to. But in that first book, and all this to say, in that first book, I looked at how the Latter-day Saints created these different categories, white, black, and red, for the language of the early, mid-19th century. And when they get to Utah, Wakara was a person that they worked with, fought with, but they wrote against and wrote into being. So I call that the paper Indian that the Mormons created, that they described on paper an Indian whom that they could manipulate in flesh and blood. And so I wanted, with this new project, that was my first book, how the Mormons created the paper Indian, and Wakara's role in that. I wanted to flip the script a bit and look at the relationship between the Latter-day Saints and the Utes and the Paiutes and others, but in particular through the eyes of Wakara, to show how he's seeing himself and these people. So he can create also different categories of power to manipulate his own, or to fulfill his own goals. So that's kind of the way I got into this story of Wakara. He's and especially the relationship between Wakara and Brigham Young.
Not to take the focus off of Wakara, but the Mormons, they were a persecuted minority.
Yes, absolutely.
And they only, advise me on this because I love this episode or this conversation, because this is talk about blind spot Native American history, blind spot the history of the Mormons, which I've only come really into contact with in my reading in the past 5 years. That's not something I always knew, but reading about the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s, you're really introduced to them, but not even in the main. If you're reading a book about the history of the United States from the Missouri Compromise to the Civil War, many of those books don't have anything about the Mormons. They just offhandedly mention them. So you're giving us something we need on this show in the RTN universe. You're filling an important hole. So tell the story of the Mormon. Why are they do they get to Utah?
Yeah, terrific question. Thank you for getting me back on track. Now I'm thinking of some of the past wonderful episodes you've had on railroads and the creation of Colorado and these places. Yeah, Jan Ships, who's a great, like myself, a Gentile, as in the Mormon case, non-Mormon historian of Mormonism. She called it the donut hole, right? That kind of the Utah is kind of this, or that a lot of scholars write around what happens in Utah, but not go in, delve into Utah, because the history is so complex, especially the theologies are so complex. So yes, so the Mormons, start briefly, very briefly in the Mormon story. They start in 1830 with Joseph Smith, which starts very small. It's kind of family church, he and his family.
And they're in Massachusetts, right? They start
No, upstate New York, upstate New York,
okay.
along the Erie,
burned over district.
Absolutely, same folks as the Oneida community, the Millerites, hotbed of religion, absolutely. And along the Erie Canal, which of course is not just passing along goods along the Erie Canal, but certainly ideas, right? We also often think of upstate New York here as kind of empty territory in the burned over district, but it's a really growth area in terms of economies, industries, etc. So Joseph and his family, though, start this new church in 1830, and boy, does it grow really quickly, as other people who had, like Joseph, not found the offerings unappealing, unconvincing. The Methodists, the Baptists, as he described, all these different religious people claiming to know the truth about how we should practice,
So they're contemporaries of Charles Finney.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And Finney is in the same, tapping into the same fervent, a lot of folks, just backing up even more, we forget that at the Revolution, most Americans were not churched. Why? Because there weren't enough ministers, because you either had an Episcopalian minister or you had the kind of Congregationalist ministers, and they all had to go to Harvard, Yale, eventually Princeton. With the Methodists and Baptists, boy, if you had a ambitious young man with a horse and another minister to come and lay his hands upon you to receive the apostolic succession, and this is the Methodist story, and a lot of folks tie Methodism into Mormonism and see kind of the growth there, and also it's kind of a lay ministry too, although the Methodists weren't necessarily lay ministers, but it was very much more democratic. You were off, and you could preach to the moving frontier and the growing cities. And so Joseph definitely comes of age in that same period.
A horse and the spirit. That's all a man needs.
That's right.
Out there preaching the word. So they come out west.
Yes.
They're facing, persecution back for their faith, which I think is fascinating. Going back to that conversation, Bob, remember with Joseph Slaughter on Christian capitalism, and this discussion of just what a diverse set of ideas are coming into Christianity at the rise of capitalism. They come out of the West, and their stories intersect with this other forgotten story of Wakara and the Utes. Could you tell me how the story goes? Because I think it's a fascinating story of conflict that you would think would end everything. That would be it for their relationship. Yet coming back to each other in ways to find a way to at least both get what they want.
Yeah. So the Mormons come west, and partly they've moved from upstate New York to Missouri, then Missouri to Illinois, and each way they've gotten run out of their settlements, and eventually they are kind of camped out on Council Bluffs and on the border of the Missouri River. But they're trying to figure out where they're going to go, and they think they might go to California, they might go to Texas, but what's not Utah? It wasn't Utah at the time; it was actually Mexican territory, as was parts of, depending on what year, parts of California and Texas still are. So they're trying to find a place. They're trying to leave America, because America has not protected them under, as Joseph Smith said when he ran as president in 1844, and he was the first presidential candidate to be assassinated. America hasn't protected us for our First Amendment protections. And so they end up in Utah very quickly, though. 1847, 1848, Utah, right, gets folded into as into the United States as eventually as a territory. And yes, they're pushed west, but they're also pulled west, right? Part of the Book of Mormon story, the mandate that the Book of Mormon gives to the people who would restore the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, the stories in the Book of Mormon, was a mandate to covenant with, partner with Native Americans. Because remember, they're lost tribes of Israel. And the Mormons believe that they have to covenant with this lost tribe of Israel to create a new, sorry about that, they need to create a new Jerusalem in the new world to await Christ's return. This is a millennial people. And Wakara, when they haven't had much luck converting Native Americans over the last previous 20 years, but Wakara gets there, and he's such an effective communicator, and he's willing to join the church and get baptized. Excuse me. And he says, the day of the Lamanite, and that's the the Mormon term for Native Americans, the day of the Lamanite is dawning. We finally have the people we're going to covenant with. And Wakara says, finally, I have more, even in my hometown, I have more people to sell my horses and slaves to. And so, yes, Brigham Young and Wakara become really fast friends. In 1848, on July 24th, 1848, a year after Brigham, his Vanguard company, enters the valley for the first time, they celebrate what is now really the second national holiday of Utah, which is Pioneers Day. And Wakara was an invited guest at that first Pioneer Day. And he had 300 of his warriors and family members there, right there where the Temple Square is in Salt Lake City. And he was feted as a really important dignitary and friend to the Latter-day Saints. And so, their relationship was, Brigham really thought that he could turn, like I mentioned before about race, he could turn Wakara he could help Wakara shed his Indianness, get rid of his Indianness, and become like a Latter-day Saint, to use the language of the Book of Mormon, white and delightsome. Well, Wakara never played the game. He kept on selling slaves, he kept on horse thieving, and he didn't act the part, that paper Indian part that they imagined he would be. And so between 1848 and Wakara's death in 1855, as you mentioned before, like, they go back and forth in being friends and foes during this period.
One thing you've brought up a couple of times, which I think has got to spark some interest from our listeners, and it's when I was reading when I looked at the table of contents of the book, this is the first thing that hit me. It's this question of slavery. He's selling slaves. Mm-hmm. And if he's selling slaves in that region, and we can add together the fact that you said he was excited to have more people to sell slaves to, this is a story that is, I think, for me, was fascinating. Because when we think of slavery in this era, we tend to think of plantation slavery and things like this. This is a different type of relationship. Yet nevertheless, enslaved women did go into Mormon households. And they have a very interesting story they tell about why. Could you explain the Mormon version of that story and how that matches up to the evidence you saw?
Yeah. So thank you for that. Yes, it is a story. It's very much a story of slavery, and we are locked in this binary, right, of north-south in terms of slavery and black and white. And what this book does, and of course Andres Resna's book, The Other Slavery, the definitive work on Indian slavery in the American especially North American continent, shows, is that Indian slavery didn't function like, in a lot of ways, like chattel slavery of the South, and that's certainly true in Wakara's case. So Wakara saw slavery absolutely as a way. He enslaved people, like I described, the Paiutes, to sell them, to gain more wealth, to trade, for other trade goods. And certainly part of his horse thieving. But that slaves, or captives, as James Brooks famously described in his wonderful book, Captives and Kin, that slaves could become kin, right? Captives could become kin. And so Wakara often married, seems pretty clear, Paiute women, and had children with Paiute women. He might have even adopted the Paiute enslaved people he adopted the Paiute slave children he captured, but he also wanted to, and the Mormons actually had a similar view here. Their goals aligned up. The Mormons wanted to take women. Again, they wanted to create covenants, both religious covenants, but also marital covenants to, and excuse the candor here, but breed out kind of Indianness through Mormon polygamous men marrying Native American women and having children who would eventually become white and delightsome and part of this larger Mormon family. And so Wakara absolutely sold women to the Mormons, but the Mormons also created slaves another way, not only through trade, but through war. And what the Mormons did, and Wakara actually partnered with them in this sense because he wanted to remove some rivals, is that as I say, the Mormons would use war to remove the men, Indian men from the territory, and use war to make, keep the women and children. So they would quote unquote, adopt women and children as indentured servants. And that they passed laws, in fact, to allow for indentured servitude. And they would marry the women, the women they captured, and they would even raise the daughters, who sometimes became their own wives, or they would, pass off to other Mormon polygamists, other friends, who would become, and their children become adopted children would become the wives of other polygamist men. So they were creating networks the Mormons were creating networks with Wakara's help, with marital covenants with Native American peoples through slavery. So again, war to remove the men, slavery to remove Native American women and children, so that no more generations could be created, right?
But you do tell the story in there that there are coping stories that in the present we use to explain this, right? Yeah. That the natives, the youths, would torture the women, and they had to buy them. Yes. Otherwise, and it's very interesting the way that type of slavery creates its own "we were trying to save them" narrative as a coping strategy.
Yes. So the most famous enslaved woman of this period is a woman named Sally. Probably her name was Pidash, Pidash. That's how at least we spell it. And she was either a Ute or a Paiute who, a kin of Wakara, actually ended up trading to actually a brother of Brigham Young in 1847. And Sally actually becomes a key member in Brigham Young's household, a beloved cook and servant. But yes, the Latter-day Saints justified buying Sally and others because she was what they would do is Baptiste is the name of the slave trader who traded Sally to the Brigham Young family. He brought her before the family and brought two captured, had one male captive whom they tortured, and then said, "Hey, if you don't buy these two enslaved people, we'll kill them." And when the Latter-day Saints said, "Oh no, we're not interested," they ended up killing the boy. And then they at least described themselves as having been kind of coerced into buying Sally. Now, whether these are exaggerated stories, right? Whether they had intended actually to buy the children or not, right? Who has control of the narrative here? It's the Latter-day Saints. We don't have Baptiste, Wakara's kin, sometimes described as brother, to say who actually, what his side of the story was. Sally is described as having burns on her body, like they're burning her. Other people say, oh, that's a form of Native American healing. Like she might have had an injury and that they were actually putting the burn to cauterize it. And the Mormons just said, I'm going to use that story of burning to say this is a torture scenario. That is very much a possibility. So yes, the Latter-day Saints convinced themselves to participate in some ways in the slave trade by writing about, again, on paper, the horrors, the savagery of this Indian walker, and his ilk. We have to participate in the slave trade, so we can buy these children and women in order to free them and in order to save them and eventually free them.
Like we just interviewed Kathleen Duvall, I don't know, about a month, 2 months ago.
It's longer
And
than
her
that.
great book,
It was like June.
it was longer than that. Time
I
is
just looked
flat.
it up while we were talking.
Yeah.
Time is flat.
Time flies.
You hit your late 40s and where I'm in my mid 50s and time is
Just goes.
anyway. What I loved about her book and I love about your book is that here you are the sources for to tell this story, right? It's not just textual, right? There is archaeology and geology and ecology and journalism. Both you and Kathleen are on the ground talking to descendants, talking to the people who care for the descendant horses.
Mhm.
So I love in your book how you bring us to today at different parts of your book. Here we are, we're in the 1840s. We zoom out, we're in 2023. So talk about that. Talk about going there and I really want to know the role, and I always give too many questions at once. But before you're done talking, tell me about the role DNA evidence played in writing this book and using DNA evidence as a historical source.
Yeah. So let me answer that last one first. That's the last question about DNA because it relates to the question we were just talking about on slavery. And just briefly, very briefly, and you can keep this in or not, but I just want to, I have UNC bona fides. So my mom and I moved. Barb, this is my story. One of the reasons why I'm interested
Oh,
in
we're keeping this in. You
Okay.
said UNC.
We're
keeping
here
this
for
in.
it, Max.
Yeah.
We're here
So
for it.
my mom and I left Casper, Wyoming, where I was born. And, that's the territory where Wakara and others certainly were hunting buffalo. And Arapaho land and others, Cheyenne land. And when I was 6, we moved to North Carolina. My mom and my dad split. My mom went to Chapel Hill because my grandparents had retired to Hendersonville. And in 1979, so she could get in-state tuition at Chapel Hill. So my mom went to nursing school in Chapel Hill, and I went to Ephesus Elementary School from 1st to 3rd grade, and lived actually in kind of, excuse this language, but like the graduate school kind of ghetto, of small kind of cramped apartments. And there were a lot of Latter-day Saints there. That's one of the reasons why I'm fond of Latter-day Saints. I was with a child of a single mom, and these young families with lots of kids Latter-day Saints kids would welcome me into their home. And so I was always fond of kind of that culture of a family and among Latter-day Saints. But, I was there for King Rice time. That's dating me, but, so, a strong Tar Heel connection. And my grandmother, and she'll probably listen to this. She's in Carolina Village, still in Hendersonville. She's 106. And so
Heck yeah.
Amazing.
We need to have her on the show.
Yeah, she's been
Just tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely. She's been in the mountains up there for, ever since I was born. So I have a big fondness for the where you all are from. And anyway, that's my Carolina bona fides. And so I love hearing, it's like coming home when I hear everyone has accents, but hear your way of talking and seeing the world. So DNA and the importance of it in telling this story, especially the story of families, and Native American families and Mormon families and how they come together. So Latter-day Saints, actually, one of the commandments that Heavenly Father, as the Latter-day Saints would say, gave to Joseph Smith at the founding of the church is, let there be a record kept among you. So writing down history is sacred to the Latter-day Saints. What they're looking to capture both in family history and kind of corporate history, how God's favor unfolds for this chosen people before the return of Christ. And so every family has almost every large family has a family record, especially ones who were around in Utah during the pioneer era. And so there are a lot of families from the Sandpitch Valley, where Wakara helped set up some of those first colonies outside of the Salt Lake Valley. They have records of how they got, almost all the families, how they got their Indian sister or Indian mother. And many of the times it was, this this poor family came and presented us with this poor sickly child, and sometimes, yes, families would come, this is according to the family histories, would come and say, oh, if you don't take this child, I'll kill it. Again, those torture stories. And so there are these sets of women who became matriarchs in in their own right in these polygamous families, and have probably hundreds of descendants now. And what we found is that through the work, and mostly through actually faithful Latter-day Saint people who have rediscovered that, hey, I'm a descendant, right, of one of these women, that, hey, that's the story that we were told, this family history likely isn't true. And what actually happened was that Wakara likely placed his own child in the families of these founding settler families around Mansi and other places. And the idea was, I'll give you a child, one of my own girls, you give me a child, and we'll be kin. We'll be less likely to kill each other. I mean, this is what kings and queens have done for millennia. Tribal communities have always done, placing their own progeny with their sometimes rivals, some trading partners, so they actually become blood families. And so using DNA and genealogical records, we have been able to trace that actually Wakara did this practice. And it really does change, again, that understanding of what slavery or bondage really means, and how it's much more, it's sometimes uncomfortable to say this, but much more sometimes like kinship.
What today he has a lot of descendants, Wakara.
Yes.
What any numbers on that?
Impossible
Estimated?
to tell. And that's part of the reason I'll answer Bob's question from before about why it's so important that I go and hang out with and actually learn from and really partner with in reciprocal relationships with Wakara's descendants, with also the descendants of the settlers, with the descendants of the people Wakara enslaved, right?
And the horses, and the horses,
and the horses, and the fish. Absolutely.
Hey, before we're done here, in which time we have left, 10, 15 minutes, talk about the horses, but we'll get back to that. We'll put a pin in there.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. But so just, I'm a settler scholar, white scholar, and who's doing native stuff. And I want to be very, very careful not to repeat the extractive scholarship that many of folks like me have done in the past. Go to a place, take their stories, and then go make profit off it or go advance my career. Instead, what I learned from obviously my indigenous colleagues and native scholars, but also other mentors, non-native folks who are doing this kind of work. We need to be in relationship with the people we write about. That's better. It gives much better scholarship. There's a scene, speaking of horses, I can do it, Bob. I can transition right to it. Speaking of horses, I go with Forrest Kutch, who's a dear friend and one of the most prominent elders up on the Uinta and Ouray Reservation. And in fact, through this work, we discovered he was a direct descendant. And so Forrest and I go to Brigham Young University there and visit the Lehigh horse, and which was a horse skeleton that was recently found in the last 5 or 6 years. And they thought initially that it was an ancient horse that was, the horses, of course, the horse history is very complicated, but horses evolved from the Americas, spread out to every corner of the world, and then for some reason, 12,000 years ago, they died off in North and South America, and then the Spanish reintroduced them. That's kind of the story that the received history. Although many people say that they've always had the horse. But anyway, so they discovered this horse in Lehigh, which is a small bedroom community just north of Utah Lake. And they thought, oh, it's an ancient horse. It was smaller. It was buried in such deep earth that they thought it was part of the Bonneville geological formation. But lo and behold, it was buried so deep because it was buried so well. It was buried in a loving fashion, and they examined the bones of this horse, and they found that she had been ridden, that she had arthritis, that she had been ridden. They could tell from the cracks on her back. But then before she died, she had arthritis. So they kept her alive, perhaps as a ceremonial or a spiritual horse, perhaps for breeding. Forrest and I speculate on that as we're visiting this skeleton. But that leads into Wakara's horse story. So the horses that the Spanish brought back to the New World were really well adapted at the arid, mountainous climes that of first kind of central Mexico, but then eventually the Southwest. And they were bred and battle tested because of the Iberian conquest, right? The reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula right before Columbus's expedition. And so these Spanish colonial horses were really well suited for these arid climes. But when Wakara would go and captured horses, he was very smart. He was a good capitalist, and he knew I need to have 2,000 horses because it's going to be such a hard drive across the old Spanish Trail, literally up over huge mountain passes, down into deep deserts where there's no water, that many will die. But also the herds were so big that many would escape. Along the old Spanish Trail, some described it as the horse's bones served as cairns, trail markers. They were so frequent, you could tell where the old Spanish Trail was by the horse skeletons. But they eventually escaped. Some of them escaped, and now there are horses. The most famous is the sulfur herd, which is near the Great Basin National Park, which is one of the least visited national parks, but it's gorgeous, right on the border of Nevada and Utah. And these herds live and on these huge expanses of BLM land. And they're the Spanish colonial horses. They're the direct descendants of Wakara's horses that have survived pretty much on their own, feral horses on their own. And there's this whole community of horse protectors who really identify with these horses they are and it's complicated. Native Americans see them, but also like Trumpists kind of.
Right. They're retirees. There are these retirees that go out there and they're libertarians, or we would call them MAGA today. They come off that way. And these horses are our heritage. They are American heritage, which is crazy. It's just wild. It's not completely false. Yeah, I found that part of your book just so interesting. It was like watching an episode of 60 Minutes. And because you see both sides. 60 Minutes is great because you'll see both sides of an issue, and it's very clear how the journalism is so good in my experience. It is. They have a point. There's so many of these horses that the government can't take care of them all. Mm-hmm. So the government wants to euthanize or a certain number of them, which we see here in North Carolina with the deer population, or all this kind of stuff where this is the way societies work. But so these people, I'll let you take it from here, but these people are here to save these horses.
The BLM seems it's its job because of the 1971 Wild Horses and Burros Act. It is a legal mandate for the BLM to take care of these horses because they are living historical monuments reduces them too much, but real examples of the horses that won the West and that the cavalries and pioneers used to win the West. It's all the same horses also that the Native Americans use to defend their territory, and the Comanche and the Utes to expand their power and become great horse people. So a lot of people can make claims to these horses, and all of them are right, as you so rightfully and generously point out. But yes, they all hate the BLM. They don't agree on what the horses represent, but they all hate the BLM because they see the BLM as
BLM is Basin Land Management.
A Bureau of Land.
So it's a federal government. The federal government.
And both have reasons to hate the BLM. Native Americans have reasons to hate the federal government because, like the Indian Bureau of Indian Affairs, purposely mismanaged reservation land. right? And blamed and made poverty, the reservation land impoverished, and then blamed Native Americans for their own impoverishedness. So the Native Americans see that kind of management, poor management, and then the libertarians say, "Oh, enemy of the people, government overreach, professional environmentalist," which is a great phrase.
Well, I have to ask. This question. Two questions. One, what has happened? Have you continued to follow these horses, and what has happened since the new administration took office 9 months ago? Because I can imagine them wanting to sell off the horses.
Imagine Christy Nome wanting to go out there once a week and just get it out.
That's right. And who feeds these horses in a government? Who cares for these horses during the government shutdown?
Well, nobody, yeah, exactly. All of these things, excellent points. I mean, it's interesting to see these people who saw Trump as a big, as their savior.
I love the horses.
I love the horses. Exactly. But yes, it's interesting to see what is going to happen. Now, there haven't been big announcements for new cullings, but moves to euthanize these horses. But I'd be very curious to see how and if these horse protectors love these horses more than I would argue, more than they're supportive of Trump. So we'll see what happens to these horses. But
we will see what happens to these horses, because if Trump hears this episode, something might happen to those horses.
Hey, so are you saying that the Democrats in 2028 should run one of these horses?
Run on horses, literally and figuratively. But caring for the West is a real thing. One issue I think that could actually unite some disparate communities, right? Indigenous communities, kind of Westerner who want conservationists, anti-government types, is this idea of preserving the West. And I think, and this is kind of where towards the end of the book, I argue, the people who know how to manage these spaces best are the descendants, the past, the present, and a lot of people would say the future caretakers of these spaces, which are the native nations who still exist and who have the resource, the historical knowledge, the traditional ecological knowledge, coupled with what we know about management. If we could bring those communities together, we could preserve the horses, the water, the richness of the West.
This is perfect, because this is not the topic of your book, but it is something I couldn't get out of here without saying. I had to reread this part of your book, this line in your book, that current estimates are that the region will be unlivable within a decade because of a lack of water. You start this book out and they're led there by the water. The fish are abundant. The water is plentiful. And we're here 175 years later. And we're talking a decade, this place will be unlivable? 1.5 million people live there?
Yeah, and it's actually, that number was probably too low. I saw a recent estimate that it's about in the Salt Lake Valley, which basically runs, Salt Lake has really boomed. Austin, Texas, Bozeman, these places that kind of post-California people, tech people moving out, really boomed.
Nashville.
But yeah, so it's probably it could be 2.5 million, as many from Salt Lake City all the way down to Provo. It's basically one continuous community. The only boundaries you see are often like you would have to see a sign saying, "Hey, I'm leaving Sandy to go into I don't know what's next, Orem, Utah, etc." So the water is just being sucked up, and unlike the people who lived there before, the Timpanogos, the settlers, and this is a key part of my book, settlers come to a place, and like I said about extractive scholarship, and this is too simple, but I think it's fair enough. Settlers come to a place and they don't see themselves as part of a place. They see them living on a place, and they want to extract the water, the fish, the horses, the people from the place to grow themselves, to grow their own wealth, not thinking of the implications, as Native people would often say, especially the Utes, the seventh generation. And so, water is being, because of climate change, because of the drying up of the Great Salt Lake, the less snowpack, which is a big deal for me because mostly I go to Utah. I study things in Utah so I can go skiing. That's only partly a joke. But Yes, and what's really happening is the Great Salt Lake, as it's shrinking in size, what is happening is that it's exposing beds of chemicals, arsenic in particular, that it could get whipped up and poison the air. Arsenic is pretty ironic because that's the substance that that may or may not have poisoned Wakara, led to his death. But that's one story. I want to highlight a story around Utah Lake that's a happier story, and it talks about that coalition of reciprocity, of working together among Native peoples and settlers who are trying to restore Utah Lake, which has long been overrun by algae, overrun by carp, by focusing on an animal, and namely the June sucker, which was one of the most important fish to the Timpanogos Utes, Wakara's Utes. And in the last 2 or 3 decades, the June sucker restoration project, by focusing on this particular species, which is an indicator species, indicating the health of the fish in the ecosystem, shows the health, relates to the health of the whole ecosystem. Its return to the spawning runs is making the Utah Lake healthier again. Birds are returning. Other kinds of fish are returning. Mollusks are returning. The algae levels are going down. So by centering instead of on humans and what they need, by centering on a fish, and again, Wakara's fish, one of his most important fish, the earth is healing itself. It knows how to heal itself. And I just want to tell that story because that positive story can be replicated all over the country, all over the world. If we stop centering ourselves and start centering nature, we benefit.
The book is Wakara's America, The Life and Legacy of a Native Founder of the American West. Max, thank you so much for this great conversation.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you so much, fellas.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS Channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Gary Fletcher, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.